So welcome everyone. Thank you for accepting my invite to the first meeting of the Architecture Book Club. We're here in Mathias's studio in Hackney by the Regent's Canal, and we're going to drink some wine and eat some cheese and talk about some books. So I think it would be good if we just really briefly went round and introduced ourselves. So I will begin. My name is Rosa Nussbaum. I'm a graphic designer and I work under the name Studio Christopher Victor. And I know Sarah because we worked together for several years at the ABYME studio. And Mathias and Adrien, I don't know so well, but we have some kind of adjacency with clients and mutual friends, I think. And we're going to move on to Sarah, who will introduce herself.
Is that the right way up? My name is Sarah Handelman and I'm an editor. I work primarily editing architecture books. I got my start at the Architectural Association where I worked for about 6 years, and most recently was director of Drawing Matter. Now I'm working independently on some nice projects, and I am the lucky one in that I've worked with Rosa, Adrien, and Mathias on all kinds of projects. So I feel like I'm the editor, but the frustrated graphic designer of the bunch of us.
You're going to keep us from going off the rails.
Hi, I'm Mathias Clottu. Originally studied in Switzerland and moved to the UK to work for a British designer, John Morgan Studio, and set up my practice later on in 2016. So I worked with Adrien as colleagues for 5 years, and shortly after setting up my own practice, I met Sarah here and kind of Rosa at the same time. Kind of 2 years ago, I think. So that's that.
Thank you.
I'm Adrien Vasquez. I'm a graphic and type designer. I work, as Mathias said, with John Morgan as graphic designer, and we also have a type foundry called ABYME together, which we launched a couple of years ago to distribute the typefaces we designed for studio work. And I work with Sarah since quite a while on many architectural association projects, and obviously with Mathias as a colleague, and now also independently. And then I just met Rosa, and look forward to this.
Great. Okay. So to begin the conversation, I thought maybe it would be useful to set some maybe loose parameters about what we mean when we talk about architecture books and maybe what makes them distinct from other kinds of books. So I'm going to read from this text by André Tavares, published by the CCA and Lars Müller, The Anatomy of the Architectural Book. And I think it has some sort of useful assertions for us about maybe how architects approach bookmaking. So we'll start here. An architect's strategy of reasoning is shaped by architectural practice and the constant need to compromise between contradictory wills and technological constraints. Hence, when an architect sets out to make a book, despite his or her possible ignorance of the publishing industry, he or she knows how to find out what is needed and is not afraid to break with the protocols of publishers or editors. The results are often surprising. Another possible factor that makes an architect's book different from an average book is that architects who make books often think of them as spatially equivalent to buildings. In buildings, as in books, architects set up sequences and logical paths that generate meaning for those who use them, and thus both formats offer similar strategies by which to physically grasp spatial experience from page to page as from room to room. There. I really like this phrase from page to page as from room to room, and I think it's quite helpful for thinking about maybe the porosity between architecture and graphic design disciplines specifically. In my experience, that can make for a really rewarding working relationship. I suppose because maybe you tend to operate, or at least begin, from a basic understanding of the historical developments that have informed both disciplines. And I tend to find that that's sometimes sort of not the case, maybe when working with artists, for example, particularly when it comes to typography. And I think just in terms of this conversation and why having it now, I suppose as a graphic designer working primarily with and for architects, I often find myself in a room with a bunch of architects, feeling like an imposter with no formal training in architecture. And yeah, I think none of us have formal training in architecture, is that correct?
No. Yeah.
But at the same time as sort of feeling like an imposter, at architecture talks, the audience at graphic design events can also be just as insular, but maybe in a slightly different way. So I sort of wanted to see what it would be like to host this discussion about architecture within the framework of the AS Talks program, but not invite any architects, basically. So yeah, that's where we begin. So I'm going to use my contribution to talk about a very well-known architecture book, Learning from Las Vegas. And I'm going to talk about these two editions. The first, which was published in 1972, and the second in 1977, both published by MIT Press. So I'm sure this is sort of familiar territory for everyone. Yeah. Everyone familiar? Yeah. And I'm sure for the audience as well, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the book emerges from this research project with students at Yale School of Architecture, led by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, with the teaching assistant Stephen Eisenhower, where they go to Las Vegas and use the Strip as a case study for thinking about symbolism in architecture. So the first edition, published in 1972, was designed by Muriel Cooper, who was the design director at MIT already for a couple of years at that point. And Cooper's background was in advertising. She worked in New York in the 50s, and it was actually Paul Rand who got her the job at MIT, or recommended her for the job. So her sort of interest was in modernist design and Bauhaus typographic principles, but the work that she would become known for later was much more about thinking through electronic systems, screen readers, or sort of early iterations of the ebook, animated typography, and by all accounts she was like a bit of a badass. And this is a picture of her in bare feet at the meeting, and the caption reads, "Muriel Cooper in conversation with unidentified males," 1972. This is from David Reinfeldt's very excellent monograph on the work of Cooper that was published in 2017. And that monograph was published. The monograph on Cooper was published at the same time as this facsimile edition of the 1972 first edition of Learning from Las Vegas. So Cooper sort of loved the content of the book and clearly came to the table with a really strong intention about how she wanted to lay it out at the time, saying, "Boy, this is wonderful material. I'm not going to let them screw it." So she proposed this large format hardcover, and initially she specified that it would come with a bubble wrap dust jacket that had these like fluorescent spots underneath, but the authors hated that idea. So they ended up settling on this glassine wrap cover, which conceals this second cover underneath, which you'll already recognize is very similar to the second edition. I'll come back to that later. But Cooper's design for the book uses a grid system where we start with this single column, later on move into a 2-column, and later on still we get into a 3-column for text. And the images sort of weave around and through the text throughout the book. And if I can go back to these spreads, you see like a real equivalence between text and image. So the body text is set with this really significant spacing, and that allows Cooper to add in these footnotes. Let's see. And the images then and the footnotes here appear sort of around and through the text. So, but the footnotes, like as footnotes, are set actually bolder and at the same size as the body text. And there are these fantastic sort of filmic sequences like this, using the full width of the spread, obviously inspired by kind of Adrien, which was sequences generated by the students and Scott Brown and Venturi as they viewed the strip from an automobile. And that's a thread that sort of runs through the book, and you can really see how Cooper is trying to expand that sort of filmic sequence through the design. So in its kind of simultaneity between text and image, this is obviously a really interesting test site for the work on electronic design systems, which Cooper would go on to produce with the visual language workshop. But as Denise Scott Brown put it particularly bluntly, she said, whatever she did in electronics, Muriel was, in our view, a late modern book designer, and they absolutely hated this design for the book, the authors. So it's set in Universe, sort of range left type, quite a formal grid system, even though Cooper is obviously playing around with it. And in the eyes of the authors, this was like totally inappropriate solution for the text, given that they were incredibly skeptical about, or talking about their skepticism of modernist architectural design principles. So the second edition, published 5 years later, thankfully, I guess for the authors, this was incredibly expensive to produce, and they only printed 2,000 copies, and MIT couldn't afford to do a reprint. So they approached the authors and said, do you want to do something that's more cost effective and yeah, design it yourselves? And Denise Scott Brown said, yes, please. So in the preface to the second edition, Scott Brown wrote that the authors hoped that the change in format would serve to shift the book's emphasis from illustrations to text and to remove the conflict between our critique of Bauhaus design and the latter-day Bauhaus design of the book, the, quote, interesting modern styling of the first edition. And rather more pointedly, she later wrote, I aim to make points rather than look pretty. So the second edition is this sort of very like utilitarian paperback format, single column of text, no sort of images appear on their own on pages, set in Baskerville, 18th century English typeface. And of this design, Scott Brown says, our small, cheap, readable, ugly and ordinary book is skimpy, but its ethos is right. It follows the graphic principles of our first edition cover. Be deadpan, don't upstage your subject, and in the way Bob, meaning Robert Venturi, wears Brooks Brothers suits, present outrageous content in a conventional format. So just to end, if we can look at the covers together, this was the author's only contribution to the first edition in terms of the design. And again, in Scott Brown's words, only on the cover was the strip revealed as we wanted it, within a format to be read as either a scholarly monograph or a 1940s cigarette card album, as both pop and high culture. And really, when you hear that, like Muriel's glassine rap is like the ultimate fuck you. Typesetting this range left Universe over the center-aligned title beneath, and it really sort of summarizes this inability to synthesize their approaches, even though it's actually sort of quite appealing to me anyway. And you, like earlier, you're already instantaneously sort of have this good reaction to it. But at the same time, Scott Brown herself acknowledges that the revised edition isn't perfect either. So its graphic design produced other problems. A cost-saving measure placed our work programs together at the center of the book and away from their products. Our work topic programs, already strongly abridged, were now disconnected from the maps, images, and texts that described our analyses and syntheses. This undercut our aim that we were, our claim that we were evolving new tools analytical tools for understanding new space and form, and graphic tools for representing them. So I think in closing, my question really is, if architects and graphic designers are both trying to conceive of graphic tools to represent space and form, how is that process negotiated? Like how does it work, and how is it beneficial for the material at large, and also for the different players involved? And maybe Sarah can speak to the sort of mediating role maybe that an editor can play in that relationship as well. So I suppose my question to you all is, how do you deal with that relationship in your own work? And like, how do you begin to approach a book project? How do you begin to develop a design solution for an architectural idea? Speaking for myself, I think that, like, obviously the design is always led by the material, but then equally there's sometimes certain ideas that I'm working on over successive projects, or an idea that I'm trying to hone over successive projects. So different book projects become like a kind of Trojan horse on which you can carry in your own whatever it is, whether it's like it's particularly to do with typography or a certain material focus or printing technique that you want to use, or just like a way of using images or communicating a graphic concept, which is like a constantly evolving process that you're honing in my work. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Yes, I think it's also a bit of a ping pong between the people you work with or the project you work in, and your own practice as you grow, and in a way it's often, I mean, more and more I think it becomes more about chemistry than obviously there is like a service. It is about clarifying a message, about making sense of an amount of content, but it's, as you say, it's often, I find it's often, there's a line that we follow, we try to define, and it's a Trojan horse in that sense, and projects kind of come out of that, and in that conversation between the people you work with and your own practice. And ideally, in an ideal world, and hopefully it's getting more and more to that, this kind of merge together, and it's really a chemistry. I think it's quite collaborative in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you say about there's a sort of compromise that I'm looking for on behalf of everyone involved when we start working on a project, or when I start working on a project. Not compromise in the sort of negative sense, but in a way, this sort of ability to trust in the abilities of others. And I think sometimes it can be, I don't want to stereotype all architects, but I think
go ahead, there's none here.
Sometimes architects can really do, as laid out in your introduction, they can figure out a way to bypass all types of ways of making a book, which can be at times quite an exciting thing. But I also think that the best projects happen when an editor and a graphic designer are also really driving what's being put on the page, because I think for me, making a book is all about these distillations of ideas and how those come through in what you're reading, how they look visually, and especially how they look, how the visual and the text look together, and then how all of that fits into one object. And I think, as maybe Denise suggests with her own criticisms, is an architect maybe can't only make the book themselves. They need some sort of other person to respond to.
I think it's also like a question of audience as well in all of this, which is maybe something that tends to come more from the editor than anyone else involved in the project. That maybe the authors or the architects who are the authors don't necessarily have the best view of like who the audience is for a work, or how they will interpret it or receive it. Because I mean, Scott Brown's main criticism of this book was that it was just too big. You can't carry it around. A student can't put it in their pocket, and wanted a format that was sort of nimble, which is a really valid criticism, and the fault of Cooper to not take that on board. But sometimes that can work the other way, you know, an author comes and says like, oh, I want it to be this, but the editor knows from the tone of the text like what feels more appropriate in terms of formats.
Yeah, and I think both the editor and the designer in this process are trying to, I guess, find that, you know, fill in the gaps. We often, I work with lots of writers who know a lot, and I guess maybe I'm lucky in that I didn't go to architecture school, so I have to ask lots of stupid questions, or I have to spend a ton of time researching on the side to catch up with what they're writing. But it means that you're able to kind of be that audience or be their audience and know what you need to help them fill in a way.
Yeah.
And also just, I mean, the graphic designer, the book design will help you make it a nice thing. Should I talk about?
Sure.
So I guess drawing on, I guess Rosa and I can be the historical side of the table, although there's a bit of that for everybody.
Please.
I wanted to bring, this ties in very nicely, I think, with what Rosa's talking about, these two competing books. These two competing versions of the same book. One is a story of what the designer got to have, or what happened when the designer got their way, what happened when the designer got, or when the architect got their way. So I'm starting with this copy of the Dutch architecture magazine called Forum, and this issue is from 1973. This is the final issue, but I want to talk about it because I have some archival material that's now held in a collection of drawing matter. And Neil Hobhouse and Drawing Matter have asked me to write something for the website, and I've been very slow to write something about it for the website, so I thought maybe by talking to you guys I would get some help about it. So if you don't know about Forum, it's an architecture magazine started by started in the 1950s. It became well known under the editorship of Alder van Eyck and Beckma, and this issue doesn't actually fall under that editorship. It comes later, came out in 1973, and this is when a designer named Anton Beek is serving as graphic designer and editor of Forum. And maybe because he's struggling a lot, it doesn't come out that frequently, it comes out quite sporadically, in fact. And Beek, incidentally, was quite like a bad boy of Dutch graphic design. made a name for himself by designing a typeface called Naked Ladies, and it's just many naked ladies posing together in sort of strange contortions to make all of the letters of the alphabet. But anyway, under Anton's editorship, each issue of the magazine was guest edited or co-guest edited by someone else. And the whole background of Forum is really as a counter to what was being promoted by CM in the 1950s. It was really thought about as a kind of ground up, community-based sort of, it had that kind of agenda. And so that would be where Anton Beek is getting his ideas for who to invite to be a guest editor. So the guest editor of this issue of Forum is an architect named Roger Catan, who was born in Morocco, went to school in architecture school in Algiers and the École des Beaux-Arts, went to MIT, after MIT studied under, or worked for Louis Kahn, and then moved to New York, completely uprooted his sort of normal architectural career, and moved to East Harlem in New York and completely immersed himself in the community and politics there. And that was in 1963. And so he transitioned from, I don't know, architect learning with Louis Kahn to sort of being this kind of grassroots community activist. Got involved with all of the kind of major players in this community that was mainly becoming Spanish Harlem at the time. He became a fluent Spanish speaker and met with local leaders and started working on planning projects with the community, and did that for 12 years. So this issue comes when Catan has been in New York, in East Harlem, working with everyone for 10 years. And he is clearly trying to, he wants to put as much as possible about this severely deprived, underserved community into I mean, not very many pages. And I should say that Catan was in New York when this was being produced, and he was in Amsterdam. So in 1972 and 1973, they were making this transatlantically. And you get a sense, I think, of Catan's urgency and anxiety to put as much on the page as possible and to make as visible as possible, maybe all of, yes, the problems of the area, but also all of the ways that this community is serving itself, because local, state, and federal governments are completely neglecting it. So this is interesting to me, especially because this drawing matter holds correspondence and archival material from Anton, who was receiving lots of letters and briefs from, you can take these out of their sheets, and he was receiving all kinds of briefs from Catan. And what I like about the correspondence is that you really get a sense of the editor's sort of excitement to send all of this stuff, all of these ideas to a designer, and also the impatience to receive something in exchange. So in July 1972, this project begins with Catan sending lots of stuff like a schedule, and this is what Adrien's looking at, are all of the layouts of the whole magazine that Catan has made himself for Anton to look at. And he sent Anton this very complicated diagram that he wants Anton to translate into something else, and then you have Anton's first attempt at what that could be. But the sort of, and there's a really good letter. It's like, where is it? It's brilliant. It's on blue paper. Is that over there? I haven't lost it. Oh, it's over here. It says, this really kind of gets at that feeling of releasing something into the wild. He says, "Dear, this is months and months go by. He doesn't hear anything from Anton after July. It's November in 1972, and he writes, Dear Anton, what the hell is happening with you? Have you ever received what I sent you? 2 or 3 or 4 months ago?" So that kind of, I like that we don't hear Anton's response. It's this sort of quiet, calm simmering of the graphic designer, who was probably trying to, I don't know, stomach his response to the cover design that Roger Catan sent to him for his magazine. So this is the cover that Roger was very excited about, and he was desperate to see this cover. It's a collage that he made with all kinds of photographs cut out and his own typographic treatments. He really likes an outlined serif.
Yeah, this is great.
And as along with that, he also sent Anton, if Anton wasn't crazy about that, he also sent him several different options on tracing paper that could be laid over this. So Anton could have a play around with different elements of the page. And he also sends this kind of this great sort of title sequence or thinking that he's really trying to figure out what he wants the title of his magazine to be. So I wanted to maybe leave it at that. With Catan sort of really kind of starting with everything sort of puked really on the page and very unclear. and Anton Beek coming up with something that is completely lucid and a call for action. And I'd love to know what you guys think about it, but I wanted to share what Roger wrote when Anton finally sent him some stuff. So finally, Roger sends Anton all of these corrections for the final proofread, which are just terrifying. But it says, that's it for the corrections. It is your turn to play now, dear Anton. I very much hope that you could suppress most of your black lines. Otherwise, I like the types in your composition. The cover seems to be dry and stark. I would have liked to see a background of photos of people, but you are the boss, and I like the lettering. So there's this kind of sense of giving something over that I like.
Persuasion as well, no?
And maybe
seems like
distance.
he liked it, so he was surprised.
Yeah, and maybe
He didn't want to
distance is
like it,
helpful.
but he did.
Yes, he didn't want to like it. So it's you hear this like sort of tacit agreement that it's good.
Yeah. I think it's just funny when you look at the two covers side by side, the first thing you see obviously is people, but then it's in the precise place where the people should actually be, and sort of like this total erasure of the people who are actually involved in the story in favor of this super graphic kind of.
It's a perfect example of what we meant and what we get.
Exactly.
And I think like it's also very confusing because my eye drifts right up to "Don't Walk," which is, I mean, why would you have that on the cover of something about really access and making this community as visible and celebrated in a way as possible?
Maybe that might have been the starting point to discover.
Oh yeah. Oh, because that is the strongest element to me. And it's the only sans serif. What is that typeface, Adrien?
No, I don't know.
And these are the black lines to which
They're
it is referred.
and they're just relentless black lines. But I think he did get some collage, or he got some photographs in collage, and there's another black line.
Yeah, because even with the way that the typography is set, is intended to be itself a black line. Like it sort of all bleeds into one, right? Very heavy. I'm just sort of amazed by conducting a project in the 1970s, like by post essentially, and this, this way of sending through what he considered to be complete layouts to the designer, and then sort of receiving like this in return 4 months later or however long. How you sort of conduct a dialogue in those circumstances.
We get to keep all these documents which don't exist anymore. Like, I mean, nobody would have trace of this kind of all these steps now. We follow kind of emails and things like that. But here you can it's so great to be able to see the kind of work in progress, what we were thinking about. How it doesn't really work out between them, but it's still very interesting.
I think it sort of raises an interesting question about work in progress and at what point you share certain things about the project. And
it's never too soon to send me something.
Exactly, and the sort of like desire of the designer to kind of conceive of this perfect.
It's funny as well because we do expect things to be immediate now, and you want to see a layout very soon, and you send me a text and you want to see a layout the next day or something.
And everyone can download InDesign, and there's a sense of things get kind of easier.
And here you get in these two books you get the case of like architects and designer not working together at all. I mean, it's like they barely met or talk about what they wanted. And here we talked a bit more, but they just didn't agree. But it's still a kind of very loose kind of discussion on the project, which we are not used to. I guess we are all used to kind of being in close contact with architects and editors, just constantly on the phone or email.
I think also that moment, like as a designer, when you become involved with the project, tends to be after a period of an editor working directly with an author or a publisher working with an author to like shape the material anyway. So as a designer, it's more unusual to be involved from that very sort of point of inception of, yes, I want to make a book and it's going to be about this, and then it sort of evolves from there. But I think that can also, we had this conversation recently about a potential project that we might work on where it's like, just from the very kernel of the idea of the book, it's about assembling a team that involves the designer. And I think that can often create this sort of friction where you end up with this, when the designer gets brought in, the author already has, or the author and the editor have already conceived of a book, even if they can't articulate how that's going to look. And then the designer sort of comes, sees everything at once, and goes to town on it. But yeah.
And I think sometimes both approaches I think can work very well. But like I like working with alternative histories is a great project of like design, like designers being involved from the start.
We should show that actually. But yes.
And also it has this interesting history because Rosa was involved in like this small catalog, which then for the show, a gallery guide for the show, that then became this other catalog that was this book for the show that was presented in Brussels. And we worked together very closely on that from the beginning. We had to, because it was it had to be made so quickly. But in other times, it's very nice to have a designer respond to all of this stuff fresh that you have put together with an author. I think Adrien, that's why it was always really fun to work on a files or on Memo for Nemo, because you knew a little bit about it, but then I would try to, I remember with Memo for Nemo, it was just like, try to get it as organized as possible so it can be as clear as possible for Adrien to just respond to and have everything he needs, because there's a sort of element of magic in that.
That's also like you as an editor though, I think, because you're very organized. It doesn't always work like that.
That's just smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
We should speak about letters on building as well, because I think architecture also involves that, and I think Adrien will speak a little bit about that, but it's something, letters on building personally always interested me, and very early on I was looking, there's one company in Switzerland, in Zurich, that does that very well, or does that often, and that drew my attention as a kind of newbie to graphic design, and still wondering why I was doing graphic design studies. And I think there is something that is also there's so many actors involved in the building and in the stages. It's so much, I think architecture is so much kind of wider and in a wider time span as well. And when that happens, when there is an opportunity to meet or to give the attention that typefaces or lettering need onto a building, it's very satisfying for everyone, I think. And it's also it's amazing because you get to craft, you know, cast iron letters or neon modular system. These are examples I had in mind that Adrien will probably speak about in a bit, or, you know, hand painted. But it's about the manufacture of them. It's about the shapes, but also it's about the function that kind of give a sense to the shape, and as the wine is popping, and I think, yeah, that's also a great moment, and maybe I can also, dare I say that it's also sometimes architect I work with, and we work together on publications or websites, identities or exhibitions, and there is often yeah, I think there is a great opportunity in that, in letters on building, and there is a quite a long history about that, especially in the UK, I would say, and yeah, it's an amazing place to kind of operate. But then alternative histories, that's quite an interesting.
Maybe you can show all the covers.
Yeah, let's see. So I'll show the end kind of result, which is the same book but 3 different covers. So I designed this. Sarah approached me, and it was actually you, Rosa, who kind of gave my name, and you worked on the exhibition, and so I came a bit later. I was like, is that okay with Rosa?
You guys are
okay,
it was
oh,
very sweet.
yeah, exactly. And but then it was interesting because I kind
you
of
did
had
such a good job.
And we were working together on another book at the same
exactly,
time.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I came in. I knew about the exhibition. I was following that corner of my eye, and also came in quite late. So some practices I knew. So it's 85 practices, to keep it short, who made model based on drawings that were drawn from the drawing matter. And it was Marius Grunfeld and Jonte and you who were involved in the curation, and Architecture Foundation, obviously, as well. And so it's how to show all these models. So in a way, I came a bit like after the party ended. So that's like all the models were made. Actually, some photography, which I'm going to show, was also made. And so in a way, some preconception of the book was already done. And I think we may have even talked about the format. And I thought, well, but I think it was also the conversation with Sarah was quite open from the start, and it felt like an invitation, or part of it was also an invitation. And we started to look at you know, formats. So that's, I think we have to be a bit mindful about time, but I could speak a lot about blank dummies, but it's an essential part of design, and it's a little bit like the equivalent of, can I say that? It's the equivalent of models in architecture. I mean, it is a model of a book. So we started to experiment with format. These are 2 different formats, a smaller one, how that kind of holds in hand compared to a bigger format. You know, we're talking about drawings. I visited Drawing Matter, so that a lot of those drawings were varying in sizes, some big, some small, some very floppy, some very stiff, some yellow, creased, some pristine. And I thought, well, one of the thoughts, which this is kind of known binding in, it's like one of the phantasms of graphic designers is to do a book that is one section. So if you know what a section is, books are made of many sections. A section is made of 16 pages, ideally, when it's a good printing and good binder. You know, binders who would like to save costs will go to 20, maybe they would dare to go for 24 pages. But a designer, on the other hand, who would really like to challenge and do something really, you know, kind of perverse, would go for, exactly, would go for one section book. And I thought, well, maybe that's an opportunity. It's about drawing, you know, and this looks like a folded sheet. So there we go. But then another challenge along the way was the size, because those books are usually made when more easily when they're small size, this, you know, and so it was about finding a company who could do a bigger size, and it was also about finding a company who would be able to agree on not folding the sheets. And keeping them, you know, kind of rounded. So it's basically just folded, but not creased and stitched. Why all of that? I think it was, you know, partly, like we said earlier, maybe it's a part of it is a Trojan horse, and I'll explain why. There's this book which I showed Sarah when we first met. One of the first, you know, we just kind of lift the curtain a bit, but one of the, usually we'd meet first, you know, kind of chat a bit about the project. And so this book was one of the books I was showing Sarah, which was an earlier project. And at this point, you know, kind of quickly speaking about blank dummies, one of the blank dummy for this book was, which is, you know, for Ibrahim Mahama, who's a Ghanaian artist. It's called Exchange Exchanger, and it was made for Documenta in a few years back. And his work is about, you know, it's basically covering buildings in Ghana with jute bags. That's the kind of outset of it. And yeah, it felt kind of, you know, right to do something that is sort of floppy and quite flexible. But one of the first ideas for this was to actually look at this kind of like the simplest possible book in, again, this kind of like maybe perverse, but also like the simplest way of binding a book, which didn't happen at that time because of many reasons, partly technical actually. So I think there was like something I was trying to explore with that, but always with the right subject. And that kind of re-emerged a few years later with alternative histories. Speaking about blank books. But now another, and kind of how ideas, without going too deep into reasons, but how ideas kind of emerge and re-emerge. I think the other thing with alternative histories was how to create a narrative. There's 85 different practices, all are very different, and so are the drawings. I think it's, you know, it's so wide and in what it says and the different kind of approaches. And also the exhibition already happened. I actually didn't have the chance to visit it at that time, and so I thought it could be, we should just kind of have a wander in the models. And for that, again, it's another interest in, as a practice, to work with photographers and commission photography. And I contacted Thomas Adonk, who we studied with. I studied with back in Switzerland, and his interest is also about kind of close-up and details in photography, still life. So it just felt like a good match. And I think quite naturally the conversation kind of evolved around that. So yeah, so then I think it all needed to happen quite quickly. So we set up a studio in Chatwell Farm in Somerset.
Yeah, where you and Thomas came and shot for 2 days straight, so into the night, and
quite early rises. I remember. I think we woke. Yeah, it was starting at 7 a.m. Following Thomas' kind of precise schedule.
But I think this is a nice example of like we knew we couldn't, we didn't have time to get a bunch of text together for you. We knew that design had to lead the visual had to lead this book because we had 6 weeks to make it. And so I think Mathias, you really had to think about the narrative for me in a way that I hadn't normally worked. I hadn't normally worked with a designer in that way, where it really is an editorial role that you were playing, I think, in the book.
It's that nice moment where everything falls together, where the narrative, also the way the different submission were put together. It's not a book that could work as a ongoing sequence. It has something that is quite methodologic about it, because it's an answer of a model to a drawing. So it's quite particular as a book, and I think that kind of helped. It was finding that point where everything kind of makes sense together. And so the center part of it is the more kind of explanatory section.
Our own text.
Exactly. So there is text. There is an index that kind of is the key of the book, and where the models are kind of organized by size, by scale.
I'm mindful of the time, and I want to I want Adrien to speak. Sorry,
we have a question as well. I can just bounce back quickly on what Mathias said earlier about lettering and building, but also it just goes back to the question of texts in books and in architecture books. Obviously, for everything which is just text-based, you probably don't want to shout anyway. And even Muriel Cooper in a kind of graphic choices is actually quite restrained. But when we speak about lettering on buildings, it's something different, and a lot of times the building kind of needs a sign, needs a name, needs something. And strangely, I've been more involved in type design work for architecture than in any kind of other field. And most of the typefaces I worked on were actually kind of bespoke for specific kind of buildings. And this one in particular is kind of a revival of the first kind of sans serif type commercially available, which dates from the early 19th century, and it's very British in a way. It's also on a building, it kind of helped to give it a sense of time and place, and just kind of try to feel in adequation with the specific project we were working on. And also something quite important, if you make a sign for a building, it's going to be there for a long time most of the time. So you really have to be mindful of what you're doing there. And most of the time we try to really stay kind of sympathetic with the architecture and where the building's coming from, what's the story behind it, what are the intention of the project. So here this particular one, it's kind of borrowing a kind of vernacular British language. So is this one, which is much more recent, when I worked on it with Mathias in a kind of different context. And so these two typefaces, they kind of borrow a lot of their DNA from kind of existing signs and a vernacular language, but it doesn't always have to be the case. You can go against the grain some of the time. or you know, just take your inspiration from something else. This one, which we made for a project with 6A architects, is kind of extremely geometric, every letter fit in a square kind of thing. And I kind of no kind of history behind it, but you know, the project felt very new, a bit odd, a bit strange, and it just needed something that just was more visible than its previous typefaces that tried to blend in their surroundings.
It is instantly recognizable. This is from the Blue Mountain School. Yeah. And you see it immediately if you've ever walked by it.
And the funny thing about these typefaces is that some of them are now available digitally, and obviously there are digital versions on my machine, which I need to work with. But most of them have kind of in their kind of starting points, never being kind of set like as font in a kind of normal context. They've been sign painted, they've been cast in iron, cast in other metals, or engraved in stone or metal, you know, gold leaf, but almost never printed until we kind of started to use them for other contexts, which I always thought was quite a kind of also a very perverse thing to do, to draw a digital typeface and never use it in a kind of just printed context. Always kind of find it like a kind of perverse way to kind of produce it.
Now that you have the Foundry, do you see these like wild, you know, printed and
I mean, it's
we have an example here.
For example, Mathias is one of my best customers.
It's because I've been working with you for so long, and you know, it's about chemistry. But say, you know, like the British song, which has been used in, I think, Luncheon magazine used it for the masthead, and a bit at the same time, this, you know, White Cube asked me to design a catalogue for Pier Paolo Calzolari, who is a kind of arte povera artist that refuses to have that label. And it has something in his work, but you know, I think all of this is very intuitive. I like using typefaces. There's many reasons, maybe because we work together and I find it nice. Sometimes I don't have any other reasons, but I guess taste, but I think taste is also, you know, built over time by, you know, what you do, what you read, what you kind of interests and so on. And as a professional, it allows also a practice as well. But I think it's quite nice to have moments in books that are a bit more architectural, or what they, I guess to an architectural audience, it's also an interesting word to speak about an architectural moment in a book. What does that mean? But, you know, a kind of like more eccentric, maybe place in a book where there's an imbalance between white space and type, especially when it comes after a full, you know, bunch of images. But I think in that instance, it kind of felt into place. You know, we commissioned photography to be this kind of traveling through the space, and it just felt that the kind of spatial aspect of it was quite present. So yeah,
that's something. It's quite. It just ties up nicely with what Rosa said at the beginning. But you know, architects making books will try to find a kind of like a specific pace to their books, and just think about it in different ways. In a way, that's kind of what you did with here. When you talk about these architectural moments, well, I don't know if it's the right term, but it chimes nicely with what Rosa said earlier.
And also there is no architect in the room, so they're all muted, I think.
Do we have any left? They all gone.
I see there is some questions in the chat.
There is one question which I'm going to read now. Can you talk about the perennial question for architecture books? What about landscape format? Second separate question, evolving books versus cohesion. Are there examples of books that shift and perhaps even self-contradict through their length? Second question.
I like the landscape format because that's there is this, you know, the Swiss instruments, the kind of Alp horn thing, which is very long. And someone approached me a couple of years back, and it's she's a player, and she's British, and she goes to Switzerland every now and then to play in the Alps with this really tall horn. And she wanted to do a book, and you know, I'm Swiss. I was like, she actually we kind of host an event of the most beautiful Swiss books, which is a funny name, but it's awards like quality in books and book design in Switzerland, made or designed in Switzerland, and so she got to know me through that. And yeah, I mean, she's an enthusiast, and but has no idea about books, doing books, writing, or you know, she's doing some jobs during the day and plays horn during the night and goes to Switzerland to play horns to the cows, she told me, and said that but that's something that we know in Switzerland, that cows really appreciate the sound of those Alp horns.
I'm waiting to see how this comes back.
So the question is that I told her I would design the book only if it's a landscape format, full landscape format, and well, she hasn't got back to me. I think that's why we don't do landscape format.
Also, none of the books that we've shown are landscape.
Well, I think there's a good reason for that. Is that I'm sorry for architects who want their plans to be set as big as possible, but a landscape book is most of the time not very practical and quite ugly, frankly.
Yeah, and there's no place to put it after the fact.
And I think we have to remember that, you know, in the end, the book is the end product. Is you know, it's not a portfolio. It's not only to showcase a project. I mean, it might be the case, in which case it might just not be a very interesting book, or a book that would just stand the test of time, right? And yeah, I guess the landscape book in most cases feels wrong. And what's important to keep in mind is just to make the best book possible. And I think making books is no, it's nothing to do with, like, for example, making a poster. You're supposed to make books that will just last a long time. You're not designing for, you know, this year. You're designing for the next, you know, 20, 50, 100 years. I mean, it's good to be ambitious about that, and not to kind of just follow trends, or, you know, make landscape books because the architects want it.
There is a thing in the time span that is sometimes tempting to do kind of an eccentric idea just for the sake of it, maybe in design, in book design, because it's quite fast. But yeah, that's a good point to remember.
I have one landscape book that stands out, and it's maybe the only one I can tolerate, which is Saul Steinberg's The Labyrinth. And I guess it's landscape for a reason. He did all of his other books as portrait, but
some people are just allowed to do whatever they want.
yeah, it's all they do anything he wanted.
I'm trying to think of the second question about evolving books versus cohesion. I'm not sure I really understand the question, but books that shift and self-contradict through their length. I mean, the first thing I think of is like small, medium, large, extra large, or this like self-contradiction through format.
I have here, actually. Just this book here.
But maybe it's not really a contradiction, just a sort of proof of concept. And that's an interesting one in thinking about how format informs the idea of the book and what you're talking about with dummies and volume and obviously a very sort of famous seminal architecture book, but I don't know if that's what the question is alluding to in terms of material form. That's how I sort of read it in terms of like literally contradicting through its length.
I mean, a lot of projects will self-contradict through their length.
A lot of monographs.
But then the book is the end product. So if you know if all goes well, the end product will not self-contradict itself. But you know, I remember making this comic Pinko guy.
This here?
Yeah,
The one next to it.
it's a small one. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not. This is not an architecture book. It's a book I made for Ravenrow Gallery. What's the funny story about this book is it looks extremely simple, but it's the only book I ever designed which I had to remake 4 times from scratch. And it was supposed to come out for an exhibition, and it just ended up coming out like maybe a year or a year and a half later. Every time the client kind of felt it was wrong, and you know what, they were right. You know, the first 3 versions were actually wrong, and I'm very glad that we spent all this time making this last version, which feels exactly right for the artist's work. And so yeah, this project definitely self-contracted itself through its length, but the end product actually is exactly what it should be.
I'm interested, like the previous iterations, how much variation are we talking in terms of
different scales, different like the first version looked like a PowerPoint book with like a sans serif type and very gridded and you know everything, and now it's kind of, it looks like a kind of cheap paperback on purpose in serif type. I don't remember those versions in between. Yeah, like they were really different. I mean, you know, not as different as the two Learning from Las Vegas books, but you know, there's something of that in the project.
I think it's sort of nice in the end to, maybe that's a good place to end this feeling of like, okay, now the object lives in the world and it's perfect, it does exactly what it needs to do, it's the right book. And then when you see, you know, the project that we began with, where there's like these 2 very polarized editions, maybe neither of them were the right book, and they both have their flaws, but that probably the flaws arise from this sense that they're both made by one person and not kind of a collective conversation. And
yeah,
the best books, the right books, always emerge from this like dialogue between the players. Maybe.
Looks like we have another question.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say thank you for a lovely session. What a creative way to hold discussion on Zoom. Thank you. The overhead camera works excellently, reminding me of Sarah Wigglesworth's dining table drawing. I enjoy the range of topics from edition to format and production of typography. Well done, everyone. I have to go now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, Catherine.
That was a plan.
We stay for a bit if there is
if you want to stay for a drink, we can answer questions.
And I just want to say thank you so much for setting up this amazing thing with the camera.
Yes, Mathias also could you could be a sort of
set designer.
Yeah, exactly. You could have a nighttime job if you want.
Yeah.
But maybe there are other questions also from the attendees.
Well, I think Elise is managing that. I don't
Okay.
know. I'm not sure that's anything comes.
There's a lot of books that I can think of that contradict themselves in terms of like.
You're going to start naming and
Yeah,
shaming.
But we could go there for.
This is like book club after hours.
Yeah, we might have to.
Okay, so let's go after hours. I mean, it's like there's another thing that we pointed out, which is the life of the book, which is also or the moment to know of the book. It's sometimes, but maybe we move on to that because that's quite interesting.
That's no connection with architecture.
No, it has.
But I like that
it looks like a little model.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So architects can.
I mean, I didn't think of bringing this to the table today, but everybody insisted that I should. So I'm going to talk about it. It's kind of a slightly archaeological project of making this. So this is a hand mold. That's a tool you need to cast metal type, or where you needed to cast metal type, i.e. these things. So what you needed to print before. And what's interesting about this tool is that that's the tool that's the invention of printing is this tool really. All the other technologies involved in the invention of printing, be it engraving, steel punches, or making paper or building a press, that all comes from things that existed before. But the kind of Western kind of metal movable type is and so all the text we're working on with all comes from the invention of that tool, which is an adjustable mold, which is just made of two halves that just slide into each other. By placing a matrix which has a letter engraved in it at the bottom, there's an opening on the front here, and you can just pour like metal type, liquid metal type in it, which hardens instantly when you open the mold, and you get a letter such as this one. Yeah. But that's a tool that kind of allows metal type to be produced until the 19th century, where we kind of started to build machines to make that instead of doing it ourselves. There's something very interesting about it, because all even the type that we draw today on the computer is just fitted in a box that's that comes from that bit of metal type. So even if the technology change, we're kind of still using kind of same tool. It's the digital version of that basically, but it all comes from that kind of fantastic tool. And obviously, these are not produced since 18th, 19th century. So I wanted to have one as kind of a pedagogical tool, but so I'm kind of trying to make it. This is a 3D printing model, but I'm going to try to make a metal version so I can cast type, but not tomorrow. But it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I don't think I would be able to guess what this was.
It's a very weird object because you see it in books about history of type, but if you see a photo of it, you don't understand it. And if you hold one in your hand, then it makes sense. And the thing is that you're not able to do that. Even in a museum, you're not going to be able to hold it. So I wanted to make a 3D model, so anybody could just print his own, and as a teaching tool, for example, because there are almost no places in the world where you can just go and use one.
It's interesting. It makes me looking at the sort of Dutch forum layouts and looking at the dummies. Makes me just remember that making books is a very physical process. It wasn't, or it's not, doesn't feel that way necessarily so much now every day, but
they used to be
until very recently. I think sort of the grand scheme of things, there was a lot of stuff that was generated in the making of books. And there were so many objects.
And also you tend to forget that
there was a whole architecture for making books.
Yes. But now you can just make a book in your bedroom, and I mean, what you need is you don't even need to send it somewhere to print. You could just print it yourself and glue it. I guess. I mean, it's how easy, but it was impossible before. Like you needed an army of people to work on the book.
And and you have Diderot in his encyclopedia. So he would have been showing the places where you.
Yes. So, I mean, this is from the encyclopedia. There are other kind of figures in the same kind of booklet about the making of type.
Making paper.
Yes,
all
it's
of
all
that.
part of the description of that.
Yeah. And also in the projects that we've looked at from the sort of historical, earlier historical examples and the forum layouts, to then talking about how we make books now, and you talking about making a digital typeface to be then sort of cast in metal or something.
Again,
You sort of forget that. I mean, I don't know, even I suppose 70s, like Cooper would have been doing paste ups and doing everything by hand. So this idea of like what we take for granted in terms of simultaneity of text and image and screen-based learning, it was totally revolutionary. And this, which is demonstrated by this like back and forth on the forum layouts, is so clunky and so difficult to have a conversation that's sort of
it's all handwritten.
Yeah, but all these artifacts, they are interesting. I mean, they tell us how lucky we are that we don't have to do that anymore. But also, it's good to to know where things come from, and also why things are like that. It's very easy when you only use digital tools to not know where things are coming from.
Exactly.
What's 12 points on the computer? I mean, that's 60 points, right? You can measure it with a ruler. It's 60 points, right? But on a computer, it's the kind of it doesn't mean anything.
And it's often wrong as well.
If you know that, actually, it gives you a concrete kind of perception of where things come from and what they are. And you understand your tool better. It's kind of there's nothing nostalgic about that project. I don't want to cast metal type and print it. I'm really not interested in that. It's really just about kind of getting a better understanding of where things are coming from and talking about it and having fun too. But it's not nostalgia. I don't want to do paste up and letter set things. I did it for fun, and it's fun, but not every day.
No, but it's like there's a slowness that is also rewarding, and also allows to think a little bit about what we do.
But then equally some solutions like the alternative histories thing that have to happen rapidly, and that generates this like editorial sort of drive for the imagery that has to come from photography, and that in a way is like
But the shape of it, in the way that the making of the book as an object still takes some time. I remember spending a few late evenings in trying out. I showed a few blank dummies. There's many others that I never showed to you, and so the kind of physical activity is still kind of relevant, I think, in testing and trying to get as close as possible to what we're trying to do. And sometimes we know it's not achievable at all, just because we're doing it by hand, and the product is going to have to follow a certain industrial operation. But yeah.
I think also there was a sort of quickness to that project, but also a slowness to it. I was very conscious of how much kind of, in a way, slow thinking needed to happen to get the technical bits right. Because I would come over here, and I would wonder what times of day you'd wake up or go to bed, because I wondered who makes all of these, who has time to do all of these other projects and make all of these physical dummies. So I guess I really, when I saw that, I just thought, there's no need to sort of pressure you with how quickly we need to get this done, because but you have to kind of create that space for slow thinking even in a tight deadline.
And eventually we made it happen in time.
Yeah, and it's the most beautiful Swiss book.
It is actually. Yeah.